866.
The question is, where is U.S. shale? I'd have been happy to avoid this topic. It's broad and complex. Also, as I've stated many times on this show, I am not an oil expert. However, I felt like I needed to understand it better myself. So here goes. All right, so things we know. One, U.S. shale oil production transformed global energy markets when it helped U.S. oil production go from just under 4 million barrels per day in September 2008 to 13.1 million barrels per day in February 2020. Two, despite rapid depletion rates, shale oil production is cheaper and faster to bring online than traditional methods of oil production. Three, thus, by 2014, U.S. oil, specifically shale oil, was widely used as the swing producer, a role OPEC and specifically Saudi Arabia had held for decades. Four, as I've said on this show, by 2014, U.S. shale oil set the ceiling for global oil prices, leaving OPEC to try and maintain the floor as best it could. So, with oil prices currently about $130 a barrel going up, U.S. gas prices over $4 a gallon, inflation racing, Russian oil imports are embargoed in the U.S. and shortly will be in the U.K. Biden administration is imploring Saudi Arabia and the UAE to increase production, negotiating with Venezuela to get their sanctioned oil back online, and musing about the 103 million barrels of oil that Iran has in storage waiting to be released if a new JCPOA agreement is reached. Joe Biden himself recently declared that U.S. shale producers, quote, have 9,000 permits to drill now. They can be drilling right now, yesterday, last week, last year. Joe was pretty adamant about this. So U.S. shale is surely barging through the door any moment, right? No. U.S. This is, and at the end I'll get to two macro thoughts that I think are useful in looking at all this. So U.S. oil production is up. U.S. production was almost 11.6 million barrels a day in December, up from a low of 9.7 million barrels per day in February of 2021. The number of American oil rigs have increased steadily since July 2020, when the country reached a low of 172. Currently, 519 rigs are recorded last week, which was up from 480 rigs the first week of the year. Just by comparison, by the way, the United States had more than 800 rigs in the field in 2019. So the 519 right now, even though it's up, is still down from previous highs. Still, U.S. shale won't be saving the day anytime soon. Why? All right. One, the oil price crash in 2020 forced shale exploration and production companies to drastically cut their capital programs and lay down rigs. Scott Sheffield, CEO of Pioneer Natural Resources, one of the leading shale oil companies, confirms that, quote, we have shortages of labor, sand, and equipment, and it is going to take a good 18 months just to ramp it up. If it is a long-term problem, U.S. shale can respond and help the world, but it's going to take time and lots of caveats. Amos Hochstein, the U.S. State Department's energy envoy, by the way, who's made some trips to Saudi, said that in recent meetings and phone calls with oil companies, executives indicated that the federal government has little to do with their difficulties lifting output. Quote, I asked most of them, is there anything you need from the administration to increase production? And they said, no, unless you can help me with sand or labor or other supply chains. Two, shareholders of publicly traded oil and gas companies are demanding that production growth take a backseat to more cash back to shareholders through dividends and buybacks, after a decade of overspending burned investors. Aaron Weiss, Deputy Director of the Center for Western Priorities, quotes, the energy industry doesn't have a permitting problem. It has a financing problem. Lenders also will become more wary of funding oil-related ventures as environmental, social, and governance ideas catch on, and financial circles are still unwilling to give money to most of the nation's oil field service companies, or to smaller oil producers that want to expand their operations. And we know that. We've talked about it before. So I'm going to close with two macro observations that are interesting, because it sort of talks about shale's role, as I said, it had become the swing producer. Here we are in a crisis. It's not producing. I always thought that, one of the advantages of U.S. shale was agnostic. It's not political. It's sort of specifically related to it's price sensitive. Well, it's not price sensitive. And we see there's all sorts of reasons why it's not coming online to the scale we want. But here's going forward. John Hess, so this is three. John Hess, Chief Executive of Hess Corporation, recently made a fascinating point when he noted that U.S. shale is no longer the world's swing supplier. As the business has matured, shale companies have a limited remaining inventory of drilling locations following a decade of exploiting shale rock, he said. Quote, it's a 10-year-old business. There's only about a 10-year inventory of shale drilling locations left, maybe 15, Mr. Hess said. People are going to be more judicious about how they accelerate in this emergency situation. This is fascinating to me. So what he's saying basically is it's going to run out. And and hope, and maybe it'll run out by the time that the world globe's weaned itself on fossil fuels, off of fossil fuels. But this is an interesting point when you look at it from the Saudi perspective. 4. Daniel Ramey, an economist who studies the industry at Resources for the Future, concludes that in the medium to long term, the best thing the United States can do for energy security is reduce its consumption of fossil fuels, limiting exposures to volatile swings in crude prices, and freeing up more oil and gas to be shipped to allied countries. He said, quote, as long as we use oil, we are dependent on every other country in the world. It includes Saudi Arabia and Russia. It also includes major consumers like China and India, because when their consumption goes up, prices go up for us. Consequently, Ramey points out, quote, there is no energy independence when it comes to global oil markets, unquote. So I just thought this was extremely interesting when I got into this. I understand the sort of operational logistics difficulties in bringing it back online, but these bigger picture issues, and talking about there's an end date for U.S. shale. I hadn't really thought about this. And
Sorry, please.
And then the final, it's sort of an obvious statement, and because energy independence has been a holy grail for so many people in so many countries, but particularly the U.S. And the reality is, there's no such thing.
So first of all, really excited that you chose this topic this week, and especially since we've been doing a lot on oil in recent weeks. And after Ukraine, we've had some great interviews with energy experts, Kate Durian, former Reuters reporter. We had Adam Saminsky on from Capsark. We've talked a lot about energy, but it's sort of like we are taking a chance now to sort of look at America as an energy producer. And with all that's going on in Ukraine right now, what's interesting as well to me is the first question that family members and friends ask me is, hey, is Saudi Arabia going to produce more oil so that the price of my gasoline doesn't go up? And the answer to that is it really, truly is not that simple at all. And as we discussed, Richard, in previous episodes, 70% to, I think actually 80% of Saudi crude goes to Asia. So there's your answer. Right. If they turn the spigot on, the proverbial spigot, more oil would go to Asia. But it isn't even about that. It's about the fact that the United States does produce a lot of oil, but these are different types of oil of different grades. And the oil that we need and the refineries we have here are importing oil from around the world of a different type of grade that they are meant to refine. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and I would add, in terms of when you get down to the nitty gritty, so replacing the embargoed Russian oil, it's not a lot. In terms of all Russian oil and petroleum products, it's about 700,000 barrels a day. Actual crude is like 200,000 barrels a day. So it's not a lot. And when you look at say, for example, at U.S. shale, which has proved capacity of 13 million barrels per day, we can make that up simply. But almost all that Russian oil goes to the coast, East Coast, West Coast. Why? Well, because there's a regulation in the U.S. that tanker size has to be limited if you're transporting fuels from port to U.S. port. So there's not the super tankers that can do it. So consequently, for oil producers and refiners and shippers, it doesn't make sense. They lose money if they put it in a ship. So they don't, and they don't have pipelines to the East Coast and the West Coast. So this Russian oil typically has been shipped into the L.A. or the East Coast, and so replacing it isn't even as simple as we can replace it here from Texas, because there's no pipeline from there to California or to the Northeast that can do it, and the shipping it doesn't make economic sense. So there's always, there's always these details, just like you say, and your friends who say, well, they just turn on more oil and we'll be okay. It's just never that simple.
Well, it's really interesting too, because I mean, the other question that I get is, and Richard, I'm sure you get this all the time, is, wow, the Saudis must be stoked that oil is now up at $130 a barrel or $110 a barrel. That means that they have a lot more money. And in reality, I mean, yes, that's very true in the short term, but the reality is every time oil gets that high, American politicians, really everyone around the world says, I think it may be time for us to rethink our energy mix here. But those are things that in the long term erode demand for crude oil. So every time we have this rethink of what's going on, that's essentially why Saudi Arabia says, well, we are a responsible producer along with OPEC and OPEC Plus. We don't want the price of oil to be too low, but we also don't want it to be too high, which is interesting. And then the second thing that I would just add to this, and this was a really great piece from you, but are we going to invest the tens of billions of dollars, maybe even more than that, needed to completely revamp how America produces and refines and distributes oil? Or are we going to take that money and invest it in clean energy and other technologies that are more longer term? And I think that the answer depends on the price of oil in the medium to long term. I mean, if 2 to 3 months from now we're still here with really high oil prices, maybe we do a little bit of both. The better spending of money is for the long-term solution to become less dependent, not just on foreign oil, but on any oil. And so that's going to be the next policy challenge facing Congress. This is just such a fascinating space right now, and there's so much going on. It was really great because it was just really cool to look at sort of where America does import oil from. 52% of it is from Canada. 11% comes from Mexico. So there you go. So I mean, 63% of imports are from Canada and Mexico. And then 11% are from OPEC nations, and 7% of that comes from Saudi Arabia. Right. So, I mean, for the Saudis to turn on the spigot, I mean, what are they going to do? Give us a little bit more. It just doesn't really work that way. And that's what's so difficult about all of this.
I think those are good points, and you might add on the Ukraine situation, when you essentially are seeing a major economy decoupling from the global economy, and having ramifications throughout the significant potential reduction in economic output, which means less demand for energy. So the Saudis don't like any of this. Mm-hmm. The high price, okay, they're going to benefit from it. But it's not their preferred. It's not their preferred situation. They'd like to get to a little more level status quo that's much less volatile.
And Richard, you and I are very interested in sort of how the public sees problems. I mean, it's just like, because it's a great barometer about what's going to happen in the situation in Ukraine. We sort of, on last week's episode, we were sort of wondering like where the U.S. would come down, where the U.S. American attitudes would come down on the war in Ukraine. And since then, Biden has banned Russian energy imports. And what was really interesting, and we included this on our website, sustg.com, but a recent poll by Quinnipiac University, which sort of took the pulse of adults in the United States. And I thought, frankly, shocking to me was that 70% of U.S. adults said that they would be okay with higher gas prices if it meant sticking it to Russia, basically. And it's really rare to find bipartisan consensus on really anything, and especially when it comes to economic bread and butter issues like gas prices. But that's a really high number. And so that just shows you the sort of the support for the American response to Russia's invasion in Ukraine, but also that Americans are sort of united on this, and that they're willing to pay a little bit more at the pump as their way of supporting Ukraine. I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
It was encouraging, and hopefully it will sustain. And I will only modify. I know you're kidding about sticking to Russia. I mean, I think Americans are heartened by however you perceive this situation, but I think most Americans feel like we're on the right side. We're on the right side of the law. We're on the right side of responsible behavior, trying to maintain a global system that works for everybody. So, and I'll be honest with you, I don't think Americans have felt like they've been on the right side for a while. It's not that they haven't supported things or they don't understand, but I don't think many Americans, I think a lot of Americans weren't quite sure what to think about our invasion of Iraq, and certainly the 20-year struggle to occupy and reshape Afghanistan was a divisive issue. So, I mean, speaking as an American, I feel better about this. I think we're doing the right thing, and that it's an important thing for us to do, along with our allies in Europe. So I think that feeds into a willingness to take it on the chin with regard to inflation and gas prices. And I hope it sustains, like I said.
So if I could ask you just sort of to forecast here what you think might be next.
In the Ukraine?
No, I'm sorry. In for the U.S. energy industry and U.S. Basically, how do you think this is a tipping point for the United States to invest and radically change our energy policy? Like, do you think that this is the impetus, or do you think this will be short-lived and then in a few weeks we'll just be back to the status quo?
I've been surprised, and I think a lot of people have been surprised. Maybe if you're an expert, you knew this coming. I've been amazed that shale oil has continued to sit on the sidelines for the most part. And what you overlook, I think you overlook the sheer logistics of getting something back online, the difficulty of it, but you also overlook the financial aspect of it, where they're being constrained by their shareholders and their investors saying, your first job, your first responsibility to us is to make money. It's not to go into debt to drill more wells. So that's I don't know. I guess folks saw that coming, but in a crisis, I thought maybe that would be overrun pretty quickly, and it's not. The other thing is I think over time shale will run into more problems, and by that I mean already in the Permian and in certain parts of Texas, there's been local mandates and regulations against how much fluid and sand and water can be used. So that's an extra cost that's incurred. What we've seen coming out of COP26 at the end of last year is a significantly increased attention to the consequences of methane, which is a significant emission from shale oil. So I think a lot of these things are going to conspire to maybe put a top on what we thought might be endless potential with fracking. So I guess in answer to your question, I think we've got to move into other alternative energies and clean energies, because as I said, and this is what was stunning to me about this comment by John Hess, chief executive of Hess, who would know, saying we've got a sell-by date here. It may be 10 years, it may be 15 years. And to me, you're basically saying, look, shale's not going to get us a fuel on its own. We've got to start doing that now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, to think about the European markets. I mean, this was a big wake-up call for them. We're seeing Western European countries start to come up with some vague plans to get themselves off Russian energy. I mean, Germany obviously canceling the Nord Stream 2, or at least shelving the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The UK saying that it will phase out imports from Russia. It's just I feel like there's a sea change happening there, but but here it's sort of hard to forecast. It involves sort of a sustained and patient approach to policy making that, is maybe easy and have momentum now, but a few weeks or months from now, depending on how the situation goes, may be more difficult. Last thing I just want to add to this is these calls that are coming in from the United States, criticism of President Biden, for example, of not having warm enough relationships with Saudi Arabia or the UAE, such that those countries would step up and say, no, we're going to do whatever we can. We support this. It's very interesting to think about Saudi Arabia's role, and this is something we've talked about, and a point that you've made excellently on at least one other show. But Saudi Arabia, took a really hard decision in creating OPEC Plus in 2016 by including the Russians, and they did that in part because the Russians really help set policy in the medium to long term. So for Saudi Arabia to just say, okay, yeah, you know what, we're going to cancel Russia and they're out, that 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 months from now, it's not an easy decision for them to do, because they've needed Russia to help act as one big coordinated body. So they don't want to throw that away and then have no control over the market at all down the road because of what's going on today. I don't know if you have a comment on that. It's just something that I kind of
I'd have two thoughts on that. One is Saudi Arabia, UAE, many of our traditional allies, including Israel, by the way, who has sort of tried to dance around this and triangulate, all feel like it's a multipolar world now. It's not, the U.S. is not the hegemon. It's U.S., China, and Russia, and they feel like they have to hedge their bets. And that's their right, and there's probably an assessment that they make, and they're doing that, and it's become very clear in this situation. So, that's Saudi Arabia's calculus is very complex, just as is India's and Israel's and so many other countries. One of the great tragedies of this, I believe, so it's easy to criticize, say, Germany. I don't understand. Why did you give up nuclear energy? And now they're scrambling to possibly, although there won't be time to do it. But why did you commit so much in that relationship with Russia and in terms of your energy supplies and other countries in the region too? And part of it, I think, was aspirational. They wanted Russia to become part of the global community and a trusted member. And I think that's one of the tragedies of Putin's behavior is he's just, we can't, it is now, Russia can no longer be trusted, if it ever could be. But, under different leadership, you could have had a situation where Russia worked very closely on energy issues and other issues with Europe. And that Russia, in the course of that, Russia was engaged in the global economy and enriched itself as well as the rest of the world. Instead of this confrontational situation, and Ukraine might have been a buffer, if there'd have been, and I think people like Henry Kissinger and others always said it doesn't need to be one or the other, it can be a nice bridge. But Putin has blown all that up, and I think in terms of, say, the Saudis' calculus, it's troublesome because at the end of this, Russia Russia's not only dangerous right now, Putin's extremely dangerous right now, but whatever happens in the outcome, if we can avoid a nuclear war, but Russia is going to be significantly reduced, and its role as a counterweight to the U.S. Is going to be diminished. And I can honestly say, if this goes on, and Russia is damaged as much as it might appear to be economically, it can end up being a satellite of China. That's a huge statement, but and it never is quite going to be because of their military prowess. But they could be so weakened, so hobbled. Their only benefactor is China,
which the U.S. definitely does not. On all of this as well.
What he's done is cataclysmic, and it's going to have consequences we can't foresee.
Yeah. Fascinating. Great one big thing, Richard. I almost don't even want to do mine now because it's not going to stack up to that.
Please get us back to normality. This was like I said, I didn't want to do this, but I felt like I really need to just try to look at it so I can understand it a little better.
Well, I'm glad you did, and I'm sure everybody watching is glad you did because I personally feel like I had a few questions answered by that. So if I feel that way, hopefully others do as well.